So first, please join me. Please join me in giving Jessica Santana a huge round of applause. This event was really.
Thank you, Jessica.
So I was, excited when we sat down with Jessica and we started talking about what we could do. I'm the founder of Nelson Hardiman, and really thrilled to have everybody here. And this is the first event that we've done with Health 2.0, and we were really excited to be able to bring people together and to talk about an important topic. I am really excited that we have an incredible panel of innovators that we're going to be having a conversation with, and we really want this to be a conversation with everybody in the room. I have to be honest. I'm very humbled to see so many people here who are not only friends but also people who are real pioneers in the field. It's always a very dangerous thing to single people out because I will overlook people, but I honestly, when I'm looking, you're straight in the line of the camera, Dave, so I'm going to pick on you. But to have people like David Sheridan, who's really more of a pioneer than anybody in recovery residence and sober living nationally, and really driving solutions to the opioid crisis, it's a humbling thing, and I feel that way about many of you. And I'm excited when we want to have a really robust Q&A. I hope people will introduce themselves, because I hope that one thing we'll do tonight is get to know the work that everybody's doing. So before we get started, I just wanted to say two things about the direction that I was hoping we would go in tonight. One was, given Health 2.0's focus on health tech and innovation in healthcare, one of the opportunities I think we have tonight is to hear directly about how innovators are using technology in ways to find solutions to the multitude of problems that the opioid crisis has brought. And then I hope that we'll, and this is maybe ambitious, no one has ever accused me of having too small of an agenda for any conversation, to actually talk about the ultimate question, right? As so many people are working on solutions to so many parts of the crisis, what are the things that all of us need to be doing? What are there, and I hope there'll be personal takeaways here of where we go from here, from this meeting tonight, where we can dive deeper. And also, just everybody who's watching on the live stream, I think we had 70 some signups. If you are watching, we're interested in what you think. If you put comments in the chat, then Miguel will relay them, and we want you to be part of this conversation too. So with that, let's get going. I wanted to invite each of our panelists to introduce themselves, to tell us about your work, your perspective as it relates to the topic, and we'll get going. I'll start just. I'm Harry Nelson. I founded this law firm. I've been very passionate about this issue. I wrote a book, The United States of Opioids, because I was frustrated with the way that so many we're sort of forced into a passive conversation. If you've been watching the news or reading the newspapers, you can't go a day without a major story breaking on more overdoses, on the horrific things happening, the drug company horrors. And as much as those are legitimate issues, I as a solution-focused person, I really wanted to change the conversation to what can we do? How can we empower people to be solving problems? So with that, I'm going to ask Matthew Stoudt from appliedVR to get us started with introductions.
Great. I think we got a microphone up there.
Use this one.
Oh, we use this one here. All right. So I'm Matthew Stoudt. I actually do not come from healthcare. I think I was just dumb enough to think I could come in and make a difference in healthcare. Prior to coming into this business, actually, if you ever go to a gas station, you see those terrible freaking flat screens at a gas pump. That was me, and I'm sorry about that. And what I'm doing right now is trying to make amends for that. But the nice thing about not coming from healthcare is that I'm not constrained by the legacy of healthcare, and I can ask the question, why? And so as we started to come in and think about how do we come in and address this opioid epidemic, one of the things we thought about was how do we bring this technology that's actually been around for 30 plus years and break it out of the laboratory and bring it into the hospitals, the clinics, and the home. And so our whole focus is using this novel, I call it novel because we're actually being able to scale it now, technology. And we're actually backed by NIDA, so that's the National Institute of Drug Abuse, that identified us as one of the top 10 companies that's doing something to address the opioid epidemic. In our case, they're backing us from the sparing side. So if someone's going to go through a procedure in a hospital, if we can cut down the number of opioids they use and use this as the first line of defense for pain, as opposed to the last line, If we can cut down or eliminate opioids, then we can stop the person from getting addicted in the first place. And I'll give you just a very quick story about why this is relevant. So if you take 1 day of opioids, you have a 6% chance of being addicted a year from now. If you take 1 week, 15% chance. If you take 1 month, 50% chance. These things obviously are killing us, right? So I had a L5S1 microdiscectomy on my lower back. And when I'm in the doctor's office, this was 2 years ago, the doc says, okay, so I'm going to give you some opioids here. Listen, you got to make sure you stay ahead of that pain curve. You know, it says take it every 4 to 6 hours, but I'd probably take it every 4 hours just to make sure you don't feel any pain. And that's what doctors are telling us right now, that we should be making sure that we're taking these opioids. And he had no idea if I could be potentially addicted to them. He had no idea that he's giving me a 6% chance, or sorry, a 15% chance of giving me 7 days worth of opioids. And so you think about that mentality, that's the mentality we need to change. And so everything that we're doing right now is trying to figure out from a healthcare ecosystem, how do we go in and how do we transform the way that people think about pain itself. So we'll get a little bit more, I'm sure, about what we actually do with VR, but we're addressing both chronic pain, acute pain, and a bunch of other behavioral health issues.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ashley Loeb Blassingame. Thanks for being here. I am a co-founder and vice president of LionRockRecovery, an online intensive outpatient program done entirely through video conference. I come to this industry like many of us. I struggled with opioids. I've been clean and sober for 13 and a half years. And something that Matthew said that I thought that struck me about the way that doctors talk about pain, I think has to do with a lot of society, which is we want to get ahead of that pain so you don't feel any pain at all. And that's the mentality that I had growing up, also because I didn't know how to deal with any kind of pain, whether that was physical or emotional. And I think that's the case for many, many people that I see struggling with substance abuse. So for us, we wanted to figure out, in 2010, my aunt died from a lifelong addiction to opiates. And my father and my father's a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, and he and I and a third partner started LionRock because we believed that there had to be a way to use technology to get to people before they met their residential bottom, as I like to call it, a bottom so great that they have to go into residential, because we only treat addiction at the acute level. So we started LionRock. There were many days where we weren't sure whether or not it was going to continue. There was, it's funny for me to be here because 10 years ago, people were so anti any kind of telehealth. In fact, people told us what we were doing was bad, wrong, illegal. Friends of mine, you're stealing our jobs, all sorts of things. So it's been really nice to have that perception change, because what we've been able to do is help a lot of people get into recovery and save them from the destruction that we've all seen with opioids. And that's, about me, that's pretty much, I'm an MBA candidate at Johns Hopkins, so I'll finish that sometime in 2090. And I have 2.5-year-old twin boys, and I'm just trying to make, one of the things that really scares me about raising children in this climate is, when my parents talked to me about drugs and alcohol, they said, don't do it because you could get addicted. And now don't try it because you might die the very first time with opioids and fentanyl. And so I would like to see that change.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. I'm Steve Grinstead, and I'm coming at this both personally and professionally. Back in 1981, I had to make a decision to say goodbye to alcohol and pain pills, and I haven't had to go back ever since. So I'm in long-term recovery and I love it. A year into my recovery, though, something very dramatic happened to where I got injured. I was paralyzed. I thought my life was over. And I knew one thing: I didn't ever want to go back to alcohol and pain pills. So I chose the other door. I was going to choose suicide. And it was by divine intervention that I didn't have to take that door. But as a result of that, I got some great trauma work. I got some great training. I got told I had great people skills and trained at UC Santa Cruz to become a counselor. And then I thought, well, wait a minute, I'm in recovery. Maybe I need to also, I'm a little OCD. I wanted to take the alcohol and drug track at the same time. And I did that. And then it just ran into me starting to use my background and experience to help people since 1984 who experience chronic pain and coexisting disorders, including addiction. And it's been awful what's been happening in the last couple of decades. When I first got on the conference circuit back in 1996, people would laugh at me saying, we got a problem. You know, while you had this great round of professional doctors going around saying, there's no ceiling dose for opioids, just keep titrating up until people get the relief they want. Then they made pain the fifth vital sign. And you see where we ended up. So I'm here tonight because I want to be part of the solution. I don't want to be blaming and complaining. I want to be looking for solutions, and the only way we're going to do that is if we work together. And so that's why, Harry, thank you very much for inviting me.
So before we start talking about solutions, I thought it would be useful to just take a minute just to talk about the problem. You know, when I wrote the book, I started off, you know, viewing the problem as a set of interwoven problems. And I think you have some different perspectives that I know, Steve, I certainly want you to share on. I tried to describe the opioid crisis as being about the overdose death crisis, which drew attention, but also the rising and profound rate of addiction and the pain issue, which you guys have been speaking about. One of the things that happened as I was writing the book, actually, Dave, I'm going to pick on you again. Dave Sheridan called my attention in September of last year to a very important study out of the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, which showed that if you took a look, you know, the opioid crisis, we track it as the last 20 years. But if you look at it, you can break it down into prescription opioids driving the overdose death rate from 2000 to 2010, and then black tar heroin, and then fentanyl. But what this study showed was that if you go back 40 years and you look at the drugs that preceded it and all the sub-epidemics of drug use, what you see is like a game of whack-a-mole, where every time law enforcement would stop trafficking of a particular drug, something else would pop up. And when you put all of them on a graph with the opioid crisis deaths, it was a tight linear exponential curve, which meant that we weren't going to solve, this wasn't just a problem of opioids. There's a much deeper, bigger problem that ties together the mental health issues, that ties together suicide, that ties together all the drug overdose deaths. So that's when I talk about the problem, I'm always struggling with, should we talk about the opioid specific issues, or should we be talking about this bigger, deeper crisis that's hard to have a conversation around? But before we get into the solutions, I wanted to take a minute just to go to offer the panelists a chance to frame the problem, because I know that, Steve, I know you have a different perspective, and Matthew and Ashley, likewise, if you have something to say about the problem itself, that would be helpful.
So my perspective around the problem is the fact that the way that our healthcare system today is structured, we always talk about the indication. And so I'll use chronic pain as a good example of that. And take a fibromyalgia, because if you think it's like 1 in 10 suicides are committed by chronic pain sufferers. And when we think about that chronic pain, fibromyalgia is the example of that. We go out there and we say we're going to try to solve that fibromyalgia, but we don't think about the comorbidity that exists in the behavioral health side. And I'm glad that Ashley said that earlier today, when she said, you know, when she was feeling pain, it wasn't just the physical pain, it's the emotional pain as well. And so when we think about how you're going to go out and actually try to address the issue, you got to think about that problem. And the problem is not just the pain, but it's also the comorbidity that exists with depression, anxiety, sleeplessness, catastrophization. And so whatever you do, you need to think about that holistic approach in terms of how you actually try to deal with it. And unfortunately, our healthcare system today just isn't really structured in a way to think about an integrated holistic approach to things, because insurance companies say, well, what's the indication? What's the one thing that you're trying to solve here? Don't worry about the panoply of things that all are working together to exacerbate the situation. And so when we think about this, we think about how do you actually work cohesively to come together with a holistic solution to address the multifaceted problem.
Thank you. I touched a little bit on what, the problem in terms of where we, the residential bottom I talked about. I really, what I see is that we have a system that treats addiction at the acute level. We wait till people hit what we call rock bottom. And I was always taught rock bottom is when you stop digging. So that's what I tell people, because, rock bottom can be lots of different things for lots of different people. And 85% of the people that we work with are employed full-time, meaning that they are not going to leave their full-time jobs or leave their homes, and they still want to get help. Helping people earlier in the process, earlier stages. And I mean, this is true we could use this in any place in healthcare, but as we're talking about the opioid crisis, identifying these problems and people who are at risk earlier and offering them tools, and not just medication tools, but coping skills, teaching people how to cope with suffering, teaching people that, how to feel pain, how to feel emotional pain, how to feel physical pain, what's normal, what's not. So a lot of that is around education. I was talking to a pain management doctor in New Jersey and picking his brain, asking him about, what types of patients he sees, how he knows when there's addiction, just very, light conversation. I asked him what his training, he was telling me he was on some addiction board. And I started to ask, what's your training in addiction? And he had none. He had no training, none, zero. And he was handing out these life-altering medications that Matthew talked about at one day and, at 1 week, at 1 month, can alter your life tremendously, if not end it. And so that is what I'm seeing, is a lack of education and a lack of services that are in that pre-crisis stage.
Absolutely. I'm really loving what I'm hearing tonight. Matthew, when you mentioned the part about, 1, 7, and 30, well, that's for the normal population. But if somebody has an environmental or genetic negative predisposition, those numbers shoot up even higher. So that's part of the problem. So as Harry was saying, I do come at this a little bit differently. I don't like to use the term epidemic, because epidemic means there's one cause. I invite people to think of the term Dr. Bob Twillman was talking about the syndemic, It's a synergistic problem. It's not just the opioid use disorders, though. It's how we stigmatize people with mental health, especially unresolved trauma history. And then the third big piece is people who have chronic pain. So when you add those factors together, 1 + 1 + 1 = 4 or more. And traditionally what we've done is we've given people what I call sequential treatment. So they go over at one place and get their pain managed over at the pain clinic. Then they go over here and they get some mental health services. Then they come over here and they get some addiction services. But it's sequential, and there's no collaboration, there's no communication. So I think that we need to move into some concurrent and synergistic treatment solutions, but we'll get into the solutions later. But the problem is we're not dealing with the whole problem.
So you can keep that mic, by the way. Well, Matthew, I'll make Matthew share with me, and you and Ashley can share.
Okay.
So I want to move to solutions now, but one takeaway that I'd offer to people is I think with this, if you pay attention to the way the issues around the opioid crisis are discussed, you do not hear this level of nuance, and I really think that one positive thing that I hope people will take away is that encouraging just a greater awareness of understanding the problem in these deeper ways is a really important starting point that I hope we can have as a takeaway. But with that, let's get into the conversation around solutions. And even though Health 2.0 is focused on health tech solutions, I also wanted to raise the question of technology as a problem, because that's an interesting parallel. But I thought it would be useful to start with hearing in practical terms how appliedVR is using technology as a solution, and how LionRock is doing so, and so maybe we could start there.
So as mentioned earlier on, VR, where it all started from a medical perspective, was about 30 years ago at the University of Washington with a very innovative researcher named Hunter Hoffman. He was trying to figure out how to do a better job of helping burn victims go through debridement. So you have the traditional 0 to 10 pain score. 0 is you feel nothing. 10 is literally your flesh is burning off you. When you go through debridement for these patients, it's like a 9 or a 10. Your flesh has literally been burned off and you have raw nerves. And this is back in the early 90s before we had this opioid epidemic. I was just curious about, you were talking earlier about how long this has been around. Even back then, he saw that one, opioids were only mildly effective, didn't really do a great job. 2, had terrible side effects. And 3, I think the effective rate on the patients was like 1 in 3. So basically 2/3 of them, going one of the comments you made earlier, is the understanding of people, is 2/3 that had 0 impact, but could still have an addictive effect on them. So as he thought about pain, he had his insight was that we'd like to think that pain is something that is at the point of contact. This is in the world of acute. And so if you can actually intercept that pain signal, we have pain receptors in the brain. If you can actually intercept the pain signal by actually putting cognitive load on the brain and get our brains are processors, we can actually get you to feel less pain. We then did test and control. The control received opioids. The test received virtual reality. This is, again, 30-some years ago. And he actually demonstrated using, on both a subjective basis, here 0 to 10, and an objective basis, using an fMRI, that VR outperformed this chemical that was going into the body. That launched over 100-plus studies, academic, all demonstrating that same original insight. But the technology itself weighed 20, 30 pounds, tethered to big machines, and cost about $100,000. So it was confined to the laboratory and lived in the world of, oh, gee, isn't that interesting? Now fast forward, where we have more power, computing power in a cell phone than we had to launch Apollo 11, which is coming up on its big 50th anniversary. And we're able to actually deliver something that's much more immersive, much more powerful, and something that's incredibly scalable. You have Oculus Go, you've got a bunch of other devices that are out there. They're all in like the $200 to $300 price point. And so when we first started this, we went out and we said, we're going to go and start looking at the acute side of this. And we ended up doing great partnerships with Cedars-Sinai, Children's Hospital of Los Angeles, to give Ali a great shout out for Omkar, who's an amazing man. His group over there is fantastic. And so we did a bunch of different studies demonstrating the efficacy of this from reducing that acute pain. And when you think about acute pain, though, it's also not just about that cognitive load. It's also about this idea that it's precision. It's not a one-size-fits-all. To another comment that Steve made earlier, is how do you find the right piece of content to put on the right person at the right time to maximize that cognitive load? And so everything we're doing is trying to figure out how do we deliver precision VR to patients in the perioperative space, both before they ever go in for the procedure, intraoperatively, we're in the hospital, and then when they take it home for the 30 to 60 days afterward, to address not only the pain that they feel, but also the anxiety that goes along with it, and provide the education and provide some of the coping skills. And then we started to move from there. As we were in about 200 plus hospitals, we started to go after the chronic pain space. And again, going back to, it's not necessarily about solving someone's pain, but it's about restructuring the way we think about pain and addressing the comorbidity that exists with the depression, anxiety, et cetera. And so we started working with Dr. Beth Darnall, who's up at just one of the premier pain psychologists up at Stanford, to develop a whole curriculum around the chronic pain to go and help these patients. And so there, it's about teaching them skills, providing them the psychoeducation. We use biofeedback. We actually use your own breath to drive the VR experience that you see so you can maximize it. But the underlying principles are things that have been around for a long time. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. So it's a behavioral health intervention that we're using to help address this. And that's where you think about what we're lacked today is, I think there's only one provider for every 50,000 behavioral health sufferers in America. That is crazy. And so everything we're doing right now is figuring out how do we actually get our devices ultimately into the home where you're going to create the greatest accessibility and be able to provide something that's going to be affordable for the system. Because it's not just about efficacy, right? You have the insurance companies, you got to be able to demonstrate value, unfortunately. Well, I guess it's also good that you can demonstrate value here. But so that's the approach that we're taking, is using this technology to be able to deliver this precision type therapy to patients. And the one last thing I'll say about VR is if you've never tried it, you should definitely come over to our place. We can take you through and give you some amazing experiences. We actually have this one. There's zero therapeutic effect to it, by the way. What it is so we put about 3,000 people through. It's called The Ledge. And we've put 3,000 people through it, including the Surgeon General of the White House, the CTO of the White House, and my 90-year-old mama. And what we do is we take you up 500 feet inside of a building. Thing falls off. We ask you to do one simple thing: take a step. And it is amazing to see how few people can actually take that step. We had the health ministry of Austria in our offices the other day, and it was in high German, "This is insanity! This is insanity!" And my mama, who couldn't do it, ripped it off. She says, "Matthew, what is therapeutic about that?" She's from North Carolina. Nothing, as I said, but we demonstrated our ability to hijack the brain. Our brains are not built to understand this concept of a dual reality, that there are two realities. And VR is so incredible. The ability to put on something and have an immediate effect, immediate impact, is what makes this fundamentally different, that next generation digital medicine versus any app or anything you're going to have on a phone. And one example I'll give of this is down in Inova on the East Coast, there was a 7-year-old boy presented with a 3-inch splinter under the toenail, the big toenail, screaming bloody murder. They put the device on him right away just to try to snap it. And then, without having to use any sedation or anything else, they were able to extract it, bound it up, and use no medicine on this patient. Now imagine trying to pull out a phone and give someone an app to do that while you're screaming bloody murder. It's just not going to happen. That's what makes VR fundamentally different than most other sort of digital technologies out there from a therapeutic perspective.
Oh.
I did, by the way, I did the ledge.
Oh, you did do that.
Years and years ago, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I did too, Harry.
Did you take
I
a
did
step?
not jump.
I took the step. I
You
took the
did?
step. There's nobody here who would say I didn't, but I think I did.
I immediately was like, I could take the step. Probably couldn't take the step. So that's really cool. I want to come and try it. So in 2010, I mentioned that my aunt died of a lifelong struggle with opioids. And I started my struggle with addiction. I like to think I was born with it, that there were all sorts of signals and signs early on. But by the time I was 15 years old, I was shooting heroin. And I came from a good family, and they had all the resources to help. And I went to lots of different treatment centers, lots. I like to say I did the West Coast tour. And during that time, we had my family had a lot of different family groups, and they came along for the ride. And my dad, having had a daughter and then a sister struggle with addiction, when my aunt died, his sister, we had been using video conferencing for various other things. And my aunt at the time had been in treatment in the Bay Area. And he started wondering, hey, I've been to all these family programs, like, why do I have to fly there? Why couldn't I do video conference? Why couldn't I show up that way? And also, why couldn't I fly alongside as opposed to have these really intensive one weekend, family weekend. So there was a lot of personal relevance to where this came from. And we started these really small groups to see if it would work, and found that not only were people, because the worry was, can people connect? Can people open up? Can you have emotions on video? And not only were people able to do that, but they opened up faster. They were in their own environment. They were more comfortable. They felt that it was more private. And when you have a screen that's at eye level, no one talks to each other this close, but that's how the screen feels. The screen, you are up against that. And so we found that it was actually very, very personal. And then we convinced the therapist, how do I see body language? This was a conversation I had a million times. You can see body language. In fact, you can tell a lot about someone through video. And so we went through all of these different things. And our goal was to bring technology. We are not a technology company. We do not build and sell our technology. We build technology in service of what we provide other people, in service of helping people to get into recovery, whatever that looks like for them. We've been able to grow over time. At some of the technology things that we've used, we've had to build an electronic an electronic health record, basically practice software that could basically be the air traffic control of our program. We have over 16 different tracks of treatment going on simultaneously at any given time. And so with HIPAA, you had to have your links sent, have them be encrypted. Everything has to be encrypted. Everything has to get sent to the right person at the right time in the right account. And so when you have 16 different tracks, we have 39 therapists right now all over the country, and then clients all over the world. You really have to have a system, and there was nothing that existed. So that's the type of technology that we built, and over time we've embedded more and more processes into that technology to assist us in servicing our clients. Then people started to say, well, how do you drug test your clients? This can't work because they don't have accountability. So we figured out that you can do oral swabs on camera. So we figured out a chain of custody and use technology in that way. So we were able to do that. Then people said, how are you going to know if they're attending how are you going to know if they're attending outside meetings? How are you going to know if they're doing the recovery things that you need them to do, whatever that looks like? So we developed an app that has geotagged, time-stamped image and text check-ins that it alerts every counselor based on what the agreement in the treatment plan to the plan and the check-in on their mobile phone app is. So it's a full system of accountability. And all of this stuff that we did was to support cognitive behavioral therapy, intensive outpatient treatment that is done in brick and mortar treatment centers all over. We didn't reinvent treatment. What we did was we figured out a way to bring it to people earlier, and we used technology to put it into their homes where they were willing to accept it, where it was accessible, it was affordable. Everybody had, an internet connection and a tablet or a computer or a phone. And so we have seen some of the most amazing stories that have come through our program have actually been people who are trying to get liver transplants, who can, if you have any drug use in your history and you want a liver transplant, whether you've been using any time in the last decade or not, you have to go through a program. And so I've had people who are getting multiple organ, failure and replacement in basically hospice doing treatment. And that was the only way that they were going to get on that list. And there was nothing else there for them. People on oil rigs, people on truckers doing treatment in the back of their trucking cabs at different stops, investment bankers, ambassadors to foreign countries, dairy farmers, single moms who at night they can do treatment, but they can't afford childcare during the day and they can't afford to leave their jobs. All sorts of situations that, had they continued, would have ended up in many of the stories that we hear. And technology was the difference, but technology was the thing that allowed them to access that. It wasn't a new way of treatment. So that's the solution that we've been offering, is getting to people sooner.
So just a quick comment on what both of you are describing, and Ashley, just to pick up on that. The technology, what's interesting to me about what LionRock is doing is aside from getting people at a point of earlier intervention, is it very much aligns with the overall thrust of where our healthcare system is going, which is to move people to lower acuity settings of care and to find lower intensity ways of delivering care, right? That's part of that's if you're paying any attention to what's happened in the last decade of American healthcare, that's where everything's going. And I often will make that point at addiction treatment conferences, and a lot of people are scratching their heads. I really think what you're doing is really an important model.
Yeah.
But sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say that one of the challenges with that is that you have to find people who are willing to hear, or, you know, find people that don't really realize they have a problem and get in front of those people. And that's another place where technology and getting out in front of people and education is really, really important, because people without the education don't even know where to start or where to go.
So it's just one other comment on this is the legislation also plays a big role in this. When you think about telehealth, and unfortunately, we're starting to catch up, but in terms of the education that we need to do, really, first because of our screwed up healthcare system, we need to do a real much better job of trying to bring the Congress along to help them so that CMS will open up and start reimbursing for some of these things, which then ultimately drives what the private insurers do. And for the longest time, there wasn't even a code where you could do telehealth.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, they're starting to do that, but it's going to take time.
So Steve, I don't know if you have any other comments about the way your technology is playing in your business. And if you can take us to the question that I asked at the beginning about technology, not only as both a solution and a problem, that would be great.
Yeah, well, let's start with the problem first. I love to start with the problem. What I'm seeing is a lot of the younger generations now is they're misusing technology. They're getting too focused in on phones. They're getting too focused in on binge surfing, binge watching, and they're not getting out and socializing. Now, there's a way to socialize. LionRock's a great example of that. I looked through your website and everything. What a great example to help people socialize, even if they live thousands of miles apart. And you can get the visual cues that way now with the new cameras, the new technologies. And that's a curse, though, for some of the people that we have to break that habit. We had a hard time breaking people of cell phones. We had to, it took us a while before we finally had to ban cell phones the first week people were with us. And then there was only 1 or 2 hours a day they got to use them after that. You talk about some people acting addictively around technology. They really were going through withdrawal when they couldn't access that. So we were trying to find different ways. You mentioned, you know, the family piece, right? So we have the traditional family workshop in our 6-week program, but to get family members ready, we created an online program for them to where they got educated, parallel education that the pain patients were getting in our brick and mortar program. And it really made a difference when they came to the family program that they were speaking the same language. So we didn't have to spend the first part of the process teaching family members a different language because they already knew it. I love using it for education because knowledge is power. You know, several of us have mentioned that. The more we know about the problem, you cannot move into the solution until you know what the problem is. And so technology can really help with that. Unfortunately, one of the downsides of the internet is there's so much misinformation on there. Some of our patients, we would kind of laugh and lovingly call them Dr. Google. And I saw a cartoon on one of my LinkedIn posts, and it says, "Don't confuse your Google search with my medical degree." And you know, it's true. So we've got to use technology, but we've got to use it wisely. Just because you can do it, do you really want to? You talked about that virtual cliff. It would be interesting to see how I handled it then, because I want to see if I've done any healing with my adrenaline-seeking personality. When I got out of the Marine Corps, I did a early version of bungee jump off the Royal Gorge Bridge in Canyon City. It's 1,200 foot above the river. And that was one of the most exciting things I did, except for jumping out of airplanes, of course, but that was really exciting. So I wonder if I've healed from all that yet. Maybe it could be used therapeutically, right?
Exactly.
We can spend a lot more time on the topic, and I hope we'll come back into Q&A to the challenges in using technology in this arena, lessons. But I wanted to, before we open it up to Q&A, I wanted to just ask the ultimate question that we started with today with, where do we go from here? I'm curious what you guys see as the priorities. We have a room full of people who are engaged in treatment, recovery, and in mental health, and in health tech. And I'm curious, just for your perspectives on where should our priorities be in terms of addressing this crisis further than we've already talked about.
Yeah, I'd like to start with that one, because I think the first thing we need to do is stop the blame game. Stop blaming for how we got here and start working together to collaboratively across the board as a community grassroots effort to where we pull all the stakeholders together and we start working together on the solution rather than have experts tell us what the solution is, because that's not going to work. It needs to be bottom up, top down. So that's my piece, is we need to do that. Harry, when you, I remember meeting you here earlier this year, and John Stenzel and I were sitting there, and you came out with your book and asked me to write a review. And I'll tell you what, that was the first time in years that I picked up a book like that and couldn't put it down, because it was just, it's so well organized. And what I really appreciated about it was the last part of the book is where you started talking about where we need to go from here and the solution. And that really impressed me, because that was a missing piece in a lot of things. Another good book people can look at is called Dreamland. I forget the author right now, but Dreamland is another one. Yep, that's another great book. But understanding the problem, working together, teaming up, stop the turf war mentality. There's enough suffering out there for everybody. And let's pull together. Let's pull together on this. That's where I think we need to go.
So, you know, as it relates to the opioid crisis, one of the things I would like to, you know, we spend a lot of time talking about MAT. And we have tried to work with a lot of MAT physicians doing the treatment component with people who are on different types of MAT.
Just by the way, just to for everybody.
Oh, sorry, medication-assisted treatment. And one of the places that, and since there's such a big push for this with opioids, one of the places I would like to see is the physicians more willing to have psychosocial therapy accompanied with these different types of treatments. There's a lot of resistance to that we may be able to take away the pain, or we may have found a short-term solution, or maybe even a long-term solution. But, you know, as Harry talks about in the book, there is a deeper underlying suffering. And if we do not address that, it comes out in other ways. I mean, we can talk about the obesity epidemic. We can talk, you know, whatever it is. And if you have an addictive personality, if you're struggling with mental health stuff, it will come out in other places. And so one of the pieces that I see with this is that we hyper focus on one aspect of it, even within the topic and the problem. You know, alcohol has killed more people than opioids. But, you know, not to digress, but we have to look at this problem as a deeper underlying suffering and give people tools and language to deal with that. And one of the things that, you know, in terms of where we go from here, that I really encourage people is to, if you haven't told someone, or you haven't been honest with someone, open about something you're struggling with, or that you're on antidepressants, or that you've struggled with depression or anxiety, that in your own life, to figure out how to be vulnerable with someone new. Because opening that door, we find connection, and that's where the phone and all those different things is. This isolation is also leading people to want to connect, and they're finding connection through drugs and alcohol.
You guys are definitely on the substance use side of the equation. You're much more versed in this than we are. We're sort of getting pulled in that area right now. For us, though, we talk about the front end of this, where, you know, if we can stop it before it ever starts, that's the piece that we play. And, you know, right now, as we're literally handing out opioids like it's candy, right? We're 5% of the world's population. We consume 85% of the world's supply of opioids. If you do nothing else, just by that alone says something is screwed up. We've got to try to change that equation. And so that's why we always go back to saying, instead of that being, and by the way, there is a role for opioids, don't get me wrong. That works for some people. There's some people in excruciating pain. That's one of the things that can actually help them in their excruciating pain. But we shouldn't necessarily have that as the first thing that we try. That should be the last thing that we try. And then the other thing is, in order to really address this, it is education, educating patients themselves that pain is something that we have it for a reason. It's a biological reason. It's from our DNA. It's a signal that tells us something is going on. And so it's okay to have this signal. We want to try to help it. but we shouldn't try to just simply wipe it out in totality. And so if you can give patients education before they're going through procedures, it can really help them on the backside of it to understand that they should try to minimize what they can take there. The second thing is you got to bring along the ecosystem, right? It's about changing the standard of care. Just that's the biggest challenge and the biggest competitor that we face is how do you get to change doctors? How do you get them to believe or be willing to try these other alternatives? How do you get the insurance companies to come along and be willing to pay for it? Because in our world, it doesn't matter how efficacious you are, but if you can't figure out a way to get the insurance companies to pay for it, it doesn't matter. It's not going to be brought to market. And in our lovely world of healthcare insurance, you've got CMS, which covers about 50% of the population, but then you've got 1,800 different insurance plans out there, and you got to go out there and you got to figure out how you navigate those 1,800 different insurance plans. And you got different states with different regulations, and Medicaid, where some people believe Medicaid, some people don't. It is just a screwed up system that we have. I'm not going to solve that here per se, but when we think about education, it's education for the patients, it's education for the doctors, it's education for the insurance companies as well, and you got to bring them all along. And that's why everything we do is we try to tap into the NIH, tap into the Milken Institute, the groups like that, come to talk at groups like this to help be ambassadors for this idea that it's a holistic approach we need to take to address this. And holistic is not just with the comorbidity that we talk about on the patient side, but also the different constituencies that you need to tap into.
I have a thought, but I'm going to save it till the very end because I want to get us to Q&A. Do people have questions? Terrific. And when you ask a question, introduce yourself. Just give us a quick statement about what you do.
My name is Joe Milligan. I'm one of the founders of Beginnings Treatment Centers in Orange County. And we have it's a fairly large comprehensive dual diagnosis treatment facility. We've been doing this for a while. And there's a lot going on. I mean, it's been changing. There's so many layers to all this. And I think that there's been so much focus on prescription opioids. And that's missing. I refuse to blame the pharmaceutical industry. They're complicit, certainly, in this problem. But actually, you were addicted to shooting heroin. It's been around a long time. In the last 10 years, the cartels in Mexico have transferred something like 40% of the agricultural land to producing opioid. And they're producing fentanyl. And the deaths that we're seeing are not from the prescription opiates, they're from fentanyl. They're from bootlegs, they're from the heroin coming in. That's what is really raising the death toll.
Joe, I'm with you 100%, but do you have a question?
Yes, I have a question. The question is how are we going to adjust to what we see in the winds are blowing? The change is coming right now, and taking away, as Harry was saying, the move toward lower acuity and more outpatient. How are we going to apply all this and technology and bring it all together to create some sort of comprehensive response to the trouble we're having in the residential treatment centers? You know, we have a lot of trouble getting paid because people don't want to. They don't want to pay. They want to go to straight to outpatient.
Let me try and just answer the question. Steve made a comment that I think is really important, that we do things sequentially. We do things in silos. We have a lot of binaries in our setup. I think one of the things that has to happen is for there to be more public awareness and the policy. We need to put more influence into the policy conversation. I shared with some people earlier tonight, I was very involved in a high-level policy conversation, and what became clear was the treatment and recovery voices, where there's so much wisdom on this and so much experience, are not represented. And I think that we have to find a way to bring together, and it's going to be, I do think, doing that through advocacy, through the work of trade groups, and really making our voices heard is what's going to do that. Yeah.
Hi, David Schlossberg, marketing guy. Hi, David Schlossberg, marketing guy. Two questions. One is kind of high level. I'm just curious if panelists, or maybe Harry, haven't read the book, but in terms of national priorities, why do you guys think immigration and things like that are a big national priority, but we have American life expectancy declining, and that's barely mentioned in the news, and part of it's from the opioid question. So just curious why that's not a bigger national emergency or priority. And then secondly, I was just curious if they had any thoughts about Portugal's solution, which is legalize everything and, crime goes down and whatnot. So just thoughts on that.
Well, this is actually a great topic in the sense that I think part of the reason that it's not more talked about is that it's, for most people, it comes back to the education piece. For most people, this is seen as a moral failing. Why do we want to help? You read about these things. Why do we want to help these people who continue to overdose, and then we bring them back, and then they do it again? And opioids. Why didn't they just follow the prescription? There's a lack of true understanding about what it is that we're dealing with in terms of addiction and substance use disorder. And that shame and stigma all play a big role in what gets prioritized. I won't speak to immigration, but we'll speak, those topics are, differently understood than the shame and stigma of addiction and substance use disorder.
I'll just, there's a great story, really powerful story. I encourage people to look it up. The comedian Sarah Silverman have people heard the story? She got blasted with some really ugly hate message, and she, instead of responding to it in a negative way, she said, "I feel sorry for you that you're in so much pain," right? And I think that's what's going on. And it turned out that she was actually she did it in such a way that the person opened up and shared their suffering, and it actually led to an incredible breakthrough. It's an amazing story. I really do think we're living in a time of unique fear and unique pain, and I think you're dead on. I think we have to find a way to respond to that that's empathic and compassionate, and that's an issue. By the way, your point about Portugal is very important. I can tell you that we're still Portugal has been, if you're looking for a model of a country that has really been bold and made huge breakthroughs, Portugal's complete decriminalization, moving away from a system of using law enforcement and punishing people for drug use, and instead focusing everything on treatment. It's 17, 18 years into the experiment, and there have been tremendous breakthroughs. It doesn't solve the problem of people becoming addicted, but it makes it a much easier pathway to treatment, and much less of the harm that we're seeing, many fewer deaths. It's a very important model. There's incredible resistance. I'll just point to one point. We've seen supervised injection sites, which have been safe injection sites, which have been used in a few cities, are used all over Europe and in Canada, are subject of litigation where the federal government is suing the city of Philadelphia to try to shut down that experiment. It's something we're very resistant to, I think, for the reason that Ashley is saying.
The elephant in the living room is, for years, we've been fighting a supply side war on drugs and not dealing with the demand. That's where the education comes in. My early work was with the National Council on Alcoholism, who later became National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependency. Some of the research they were involved with, NIDA and SAMHSA, was looking how early education and information help people become less likely to become addicted. We're talking about teenagers especially. If they were caught early, and that early means before age 9 or 10, they start educating young. So we need to start working on the demand side of the disease, not the supply side, because the supply side is always going to be there.
Great point.
Thank you. My name is Jay Westbrook. I'm a clinical bedside hospice nurse and grief recovery specialist. And back in the height of the AIDS epidemic, when everyone was dying, we saw people who survived starting to shut down and not go to funerals. The grief, I mean, you couldn't grieve one person before your neighbor died. You couldn't grieve that person before the next one died. I got recruited to do some work in the treatment industry with grief counseling, and it seemed to make a big difference. And now I'm seeing young people who have had so many deaths, they're just shut down. And when Ashley spoke about you have to address that psychosocial side, you have to do the therapy with it. I'm wondering what you're seeing in terms of young people who've experienced the death of so many of their peers shutting down and becoming unreachable and just following in that same path?
So, you know, it's kind of like, it depends on which way they were leaning in the first place. In some cases, with people, it's this huge eye opener that they need to turn it around. It's the thing that kind of someone close to them dies and they realize they're mortal. And then, you know, that has some sort of awakening. But for a lot of people, it's just another trauma in a long line of traumas. And, you know, something that Steve and I were talking about was that so much of substance use disorder, so much of what we're dealing with is underlying trauma, and treating the trauma is such a huge part of the, you know, the problem and the solution. And it's adding trauma. It's just making the work harder because people are continually losing people around them. I think it's just an occupational hazard at this point. It's just part of the recovery and addiction landscape, is that people are dying much more frequently. And that, you know, we have to really, really address trauma and be better at addressing trauma for people so that they can recover and, again, learn how to deal with, you know, it's so much of this is about learning how to deal with your suffering, as opposed to expecting that it's going to be eliminated, expecting there won't be any. I don't know where this comes from, and I'm totally guilty of it, which is, well, why is this hard? Or how, you know, why is this unfair? Whatever, you know, you hear, I have my little kids, but this is unfair. Like, where did we get this idea that things were going to be fair or comfortable? But that is a real problem, and teaching people that these things, you know, that's part of life, and how to move through that without killing yourselves is where we need to go.
So Jay, that also brings up another thing that I was thinking about is, you know, when you think about a family that's going through, and I know you're doing the palliative side of the equation, and you've got the caregivers that are also, in a sense, patients in this whole thing. They suffer a lot of trauma. Yeah. And so there's some really fascinating work that's being done in the world of virtual reality, where you can actually help create empathy, both for those that are servicing the caregivers themselves, to help them understand what it's like to deal with a loved one that's going through something, but also to help that caregiver, him or herself, have understand what it's like to actually go through the palliative side of the equation and go through a death. So you can create greater empathy. It's something that Harry mentioned earlier today, this idea that empathy is something that we all need to find a better way of having it for each other. And so one of the fundamental principles of VR is the ability to put you into someone else's shoes and live a day in the life of what they're going through. And so for providers, practitioners who may have never experienced this themselves, you can actually help them understand what it's like to be a caregiver, what it's like to be that person that's going through the particular the issue, whatever that issue is, so that they have more empathy and they're more empathetic in the way that they deal with the caregivers, the way they deal with or in the case of this, if you have kids that are experiencing this stuff, help them have empathy, or those that are helping them, help those people have empathy for the child themselves.
Wanted to, all right, we'll take one question here, and then we have some questions on the live stream also. So yeah, let me give you the mic.
Ashley, you mentioned that you work with a number of different countries, and I'm curious to understand a bit more around the impact of the culture on this notion of suffering, because, you know, in Taoism, suffering is the way, and, you know, I'm just curious, what have you found, and if there's any explanation there?
Sure. So I would love to have treatment that was super culturally aware for each different culture, but at the moment that hasn't been the case. So the people seeking treatment from us are typically expats or people in countries where drugs and alcohol aren't legal. So I don't think that we are working with the people who their cultural beliefs are so vastly different that we haven't been able to have it, like they're dealing with starving on a daily basis and we're talking about addiction to cell phones. Like I don't think the discrepancy is so huge with the people that have come to us. I do see that as something that we will deal with over time. There have been cultural competency stuff. For a while, we were getting a lot of people from Saudi Arabia, and dealing with a very different cultural beliefs around that. And a lot of that stuff, they would work, we put them with people who are culturally competent, but that's a big piece of it because recovery does look different in different cultures or different beliefs, including not wanting an abstinence model, using other, Sinclair. There's been a lot of different things. So to give you an idea of our international work, it's been a lot of people who fit well into the program. And I think that when we get to a place of much wider reach, much bigger, that will be something that we will have to deal with and have our people much more trained in how to work internationally.
Just wanted to comment along those lines in terms of the way that we in America think about pain, right? We all want to take a pill so we can eliminate that pain, whatever the challenges that we have. We're lazy, right? We want to have something that is fixed so we don't have to worry about it. But I think we're the one of only 2 countries in the world that actually, for labor delivery as an example, uses an epidural, where most of this is, we've been around for thousands of years, millennials, and women have been giving birth. And we in America say we got to mask that pain. We got to do something. And my wife will say, "Thank God for that." Yes, it's very easy for me to say. We actually, though, we're using VR. We've delivered over like 200 babies, and using VR where they've used no sedation or anything. And so we've seen like outreach from Italy and Europe in general across the board. Belgium, for some reason, freaking loves us. We're in almost every hospital over in Belgium. And it's just a different mentality that they have around what pain is. That pain is something that you're going to have. It's just how do you do a better job of coping with that pain? And in America, we've been taught that we're not supposed to have pain. We shouldn't feel it. And that's why I go back to it's something that's unique to what we do in America. I would love to know the addiction rates in some of these other countries. Are they as high as what they are here because of the way we do things?
Just a comment about that in terms of the people we worked with in Saudi Arabia. A lot of the stuff about reducing shame and stigma and, going to open meetings and finding a support group. And there was a lot of stuff around that we had to rethink about being open about particularly women, how in places where you could not be open about that. And so we created other resources for them, found online resources for them, really had to acknowledge that some of these shame and stigma things that we were trying to talk about and overcome here that were plausible here are not plausible there, and to respect that.
Sorry, and by the way, for gentlemen out there, if you ever want to give your wife a VR device when she's going through labor, do not do it in the moment that she's trying to go through labor. If you're going to introduce her to her, educate her about it beforehand. Terrible idea.
Great tip. So we've got just a few more minutes for questions, and then I hope people will stick around. But Miguel Saldate, why don't you read us the 4 questions that came in via the live stream? Thank you.
Okay, our first question comes from Darlene. Given that the issue is no longer specialized but globalized, is anyone advocating for MDs to have addiction medicine training before they get licensed?
Will you go through all the questions just so we can try to get more?
Second question is, how do we fight the fact that the pharmaceutical companies have the ears of doctors more than preventionists do? Our third question is, has anyone considered combining VR and clinical hypnosis together for a synergistic effect? And then I believe our last one was collaborations between transplant centers and recovery centers. Does anyone know if this is going on so far?
Does anyone remember the question?
Yeah, I can hit one of them very easily. So from the clinical hypnosis, combining it with VR, that's actually something that we've been working on that. And again, we're a big believer it's not a one size fits all, and that what is maybe right for one person is not right for another person. We've we've seen it in a ton of clinical studies that we've done in RCTs at Cedars-Sinai and other hospitals around the U.S. So yes, we are looking at that.
The transplant question, we have worked with a lot of various Mayo clinics and as a preferred provider.
Perverted provider? Oh no!
Anyone, that's recorded, isn't it?
Yeah. You got it.
But you know what I mean.
The question that intrigued me was the one about MDs going in school, because up until just recently, most of the medical schools, they got very, very little education on addiction. There were more progressive ones. Back in the 1990s, I was teaching at Stanford Medical School to where I had 40 hours to take people through addiction recovery and relapse prevention. But they were alone in the crowd. But now, over the last few years, directly as a result of the American Society of Addiction Medicine, it's been added to the curriculum of most medical schools. So it is coming, and
That's
it's
great.
becoming more normalized now.
Did we get them all?
We have one more. We have one more question
Pharma.
about,
That's for
about
you.
Fight
pharma.
Pharma.
Yeah, that's a Harry
There are
question.
lots of places, there's lots of, if you want to fight pharma, just read the newspaper, watch the opioid litigation, they're going to be paying billions of dollars. It really is, it's a fair question, it's just not the question for tonight. So, all right, so we're going to take one last question and then go ahead and then we're going to wrap up.
Hi there, Sam Kim. I'm a physician and entrepreneur. So there's a lot, you guys hit a lot of things in terms of how this endemic is multifactorial. And a lot of the solutions that you guys are providing right now are very siloed, which is a problem with healthcare these days right now. So my first question would be, is if you had to create the ideal ecosystem, what would a very successful treatment regimen look like in your eyes? And then number two is you guys talked a lot about education, but who are we educating and what are we educating them with?
Mm-hmm.
You hit upon it with doctors, learning about opiate addiction. Like I took an 8-hour course to prescribe buprenorphine. Like it's 8-hour video course, so I'm just a lot more as a physician, I'm very conscientious about what's best for my patient. And if I follow that moral compass, I always find myself in the right. But when you talk about education, I think it's very difficult to is it dare to stay
I
out
dare you to
drugs?
learn.
Yeah, exactly. So those are my two questions.
Okay, let me talk, you talked about what would my concept of an ideal treatment regimen be. Well, it's one that meets the person where they're at, number one. It's going in and doing really accurate assessments in 4 quadrants: biological, psychological, social, and spiritual. And then developing a treatment plan that addresses each of those to improve people's quality of life and level of functioning in all 4 domains at the same time. Unfortunately, because of the silo system, that's really hard for insurance payers to come together with. That's why when we talk about coming together, one of the stakeholders needs to be the insurance industry. They need to be part of the table discussion. And because we've all got to be pulling in the same direction. Right now, we're pulling in different directions. Mental health is pulling against substance use. Pain management is pulling against both of them and vice versa. So we've got to start pulling together. Because, I used to have one of my slides, it showed the turf war mentality. You had this tug of war on this big rock. And all of a sudden, the rope breaks and both sides fall in the ocean. And that's what we're at risk for right now, is all of us are going to fall in the ocean if we don't start pulling together. And people have mentioned a lot today about pain, suffering, and that's one of my areas I really love focusing on. When I work with pain patients, what I found is most of their symptoms are psychological, emotional. And that's what they were really using the medication for. They were not using it for the physical symptoms of pain. They were using it for the psychological, emotional. I've developed an instrument how to go in early on. So that was one of our 13 outcome measures, is to help patients see how much of their pain is physiological versus psychological, emotional, and then develop the treatment plan again to address the person where they're at with that and improve the levels. And we had some phenomenal outcomes by doing that.
Oh gosh, I blanked on one of the things. One of the is scope of practice. So that's a huge reason where the silos, we have hired people who have both mental health and addiction, but you have to get all sorts of different licensing, certification, where can you work? It's a lot of it's regulation stuff. So that's what makes it really difficult, but I agree with you. I would like to see physicians go and spend some amount of time in a treatment center, whether that's sitting in groups or, sitting in sessions. And I would like to see, maybe even there's, internships, or that's part of a residency. Again, don't have enough information to know that that would be even viable, but have physicians who were doing this stuff come in close and see what the work is being done and what that really means, what that looks like up close, and know the stories of the people, see what it looks like on the other end, up close in treatment, and get that human perspective, as opposed to an 8-hour course, which is great, but it's not the same as going into the treatment center and sitting in a group with those people and having the faces to the names of what we're dealing with.
Let me tag on that, because early in my career, my first medical director I worked with, Dr. Jerry Calloway, was a professor at Stanford Medical School. He set up a program to every cohort. They would enroll 2 of their last year's students into our addiction treatment program as patients.
Yes.
And they would go through 4 weeks as a patient. Same protocols, same bed, same food, same everything. And those people that went through that, the men and women that went through that, I would have no hesitancy referring addiction patients to.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that.
So just on the education front of that, by the way, Stephen, I thought you captured it perfectly in terms of how do you make it, break down the silos, right? So I'm not going to add to that. But on the education piece of this, we talk about who you educate. One is obviously you got to educate the doctors. 2 is when you're talking about educating the patients. So I'll give you an example of this. A lot of us understand you're supposed to eat healthy and do all these things, right? So education is, you can give all the education you want, but if it doesn't connect with someone at an emotional level or a non-conscious level, it's not going to change their behavior. It's what the whole world of behavioral economics is about. And so one of the things you can do that's unique in the world of VR is that we can actually help connect at an empathetic level or a non-conscious level. The example we have is we did a program with the Hearst Foundation in Cedars-Sinai, where we went into, we were looking at how can we drive behavior change for an African-American community to help address hypertension. We decided we're going to focus on trying to address their salt intake and try to change the types of food they consume. And so we created something for them where we actually would give them an education piece, where we would take you inside. They would sit there and they would pick some food that was culturally relevant to them. And then we would show them what would happen inside the cardiovascular system, inside the kidneys, by literally taking them into their own body and giving them an empathetic connection so they can feel something that you could never feel on your own just by sitting there watching it. So by putting it into VR, taking you into that, we were able to connect at that non-conscious, that empathetic level. And then on top of that, though, it's not just simply about changing their behavior, because when someone gets stressed out, they revert back to that which gives them comfort. And so you need to give them the coping skills as well. So we use CBT that was actually administered the voice of their pastor. It was a 10,000 strong congregation here in LA. We got a 7-point drop in their blood pressure over a 8-week intervention with some very minimal VR in terms of the actual immersiveness of it. But it was because the education we took was not simply about telling them something, but it was about demonstrating it for them, taking them into their own body to experience their body in a way they never could otherwise. And that's the type of education we think about when how do you actually want to help someone really understand it at a visceral level, at a gut level.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been a great conversation. I'm sorry to have to cut it off because it's obviously this is a topic that's been engaging. I really want to thank the panelists. I want to leave a final thought. I was, on that question of where do we go from here. Being in this room, I think, even beyond the panel, we're sitting in a room of doctors, of mental health professionals, of people working in recovery, of hypnotherapists, ag register. who are doing incredible work, right? We're in a room of people doing health tech startups. Dave Whalen on how do we get healthy, right? The work is being done on if we look at everything that everybody is doing as a mosaic, we're all so many of us are working on different pieces of the puzzle, and I think part of it is bringing that consciousness and making it more clear so that it just gets more and more into the awareness. That's not we do need systemic change. One of the things that I really argue in the book is that we have to pull beyond healthcare, look for other systems, whether it's our schools, whether it's our workplaces, civic communities, faith communities, to bring everybody into really systemically bringing the wisdom that you guys have expressed into the equation. But in the meantime, I do think that we all are, so many people in this room are doing such important work, and it's really a matter of sharing it and connecting it to the solutions. And so I was going to take the last word, Steve. If I hand you the mic, you got the last word. This is, and then I want to encourage people to. I'm going to give it, Steve. I'll let you do this. And then I hope people will stick around for more conversation, more questions.
Ashley and I were talking before, and both of us agreed that one of the things we'd hate to see happen is for you guys to sit through this whole discussion and not go out and do something with it. So I end all my professional trainings with the same thing. I ask people to come up with 3 calls to action. What are 3 things you've got that so you can do 3 things differently after you leave here? And the most important part, who are your 3 accountability partners? And I'd encourage you to share those things with somebody as we're doing the networking piece. What did you get and what are you going to do with it? And who are you going to pick to help hold yourself accountable? That's how I'd like to end.
All right. Again, a huge thank you to Jessica Santana, Jennifer Cohen, and hopefully you'll stick around. Thank you.